Hey folks, my name is Olivia McNair, and I'm a senior at Perham High School in Perham, Minnesota, and I'm in the category of original oratory, which is a persuasive call to action category where participants write their own original material and perform it. As 2019 came to a close, multiple media outlets dubbed it the year of the protest, as protests from around the world made headlines. And here in our own country, a top story elicited strong responses and protests from both sides. The divisive issue of jailing and detaining parents for simply wanting to give their children a chance at a better life. Parents so desperate they were willing to pay bribes to gain entry and get beyond walls. Yeah, it's really tough to know how to feel about Felicity Huffman going to prison. What did you guys think I was talking about? Of course I was talking about the college admissions scandal where wealthy parents broke the law and paid a smuggler to sneak their kids over the ivy-covered walls of elite colleges. When President Obama was elected into office in 2008, National Public Radio declared, "America is entering a post-racial age, one in which people of all races have equal opportunities." The media believed that Martin Luther King's dream had finally come true with the election of our first black president. But today we know that this post-racial society where everyone is treated equally was just as real as a stable middle class. Now, the racial disparities in how we view crime are well documented. We're poor, migrant mothers trying to protect their children are vilified, while white, wealthy mothers doing the exact same thing are simply a comedic punchline on a late-night talk show. And if you doubt that, then all you have to do is read the news. Because when it comes to immigration, Reuters describes it as a crackdown, while the New York Times writes that these wealthy parents were caught up in what they've dubbed Operation Varsity Blues. Sounds like a new Netflix series, doesn't it? I can see my watch list now. Schitt's Creek, Shameless, Operation Varsity Blues. The Washington Examiner reminds us that migrants are thrown in jail for breaking the law, while Time magazine describes Felicity Huffman serving time for committing an offense. Serving time. They make her sound almost benevolent, like she's knitting mittens for orphans. Now, there is another area where the behavior of white people is sugar-coated in this same way, where this post-racial illusion is just as glaring, yet less acknowledged. In that top story of 2019, political protests. By comparing and contrasting these protests, it's easy to see that nothing has really changed since the days when civil rights activists marched with Dr. King from Selma to Montgomery. Now, in order to refute this claim that we've achieved this post-racial society where everyone is equal, I'm going to take a bit of an unconventional approach by comparing and contrasting two sets of protests side by side. First, paying attention to why these groups formed. Then, looking at the actions and behaviors that these groups engaged in, before finally discussing how people responded to them. By laying the evidence out a step at a time, you'll see that we still have a long march to achieve that post-racial dream. So, let's start in 2013 when a protest group formed as they felt their civil rights and liberties were being infringed upon by the government. This group decided to conduct peaceful protests around the country in order to bring awareness to their concerns. And then just a few years later, 2016, a similar protest formed, as they too felt their civil rights and liberties were being infringed upon by the government. However, this group decided to conduct an armed protest in order to make people aware of their concerns. So while these protests formed for the same reason, you'll see that the actions they took and the responses they received are vastly different. Now, this first group organized marches and rallies in public places, sometimes disrupting traffic in order to be seen and heard. And while this was frustrating to people, no one was ever in danger, and the inconvenience that this group caused was short-term, lasting only a few hours. And now the second group decided to conduct an armed takeover of federal land. For 41 days, this group shut down and controlled this tourist destination, pointing guns at our law enforcement officers who gathered to protect the public. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service estimates that this protest cost taxpayers $6 million. And one protester was even shot and killed by the police. So, as you can see, very different methods of protesting. So let's look at how each of these groups were received. This first movement, Black Lives Matter, originally formed when 3 African American women were upset with how people of color were being treated by law enforcement. British newspaper The Guardian revealed that this group is classified as extremists in a leaked report from the FBI. In addition, former governor and vice presidential candidate Sarah Palin has referred to members of Black Lives Matter as thugs, while everyone from a police chief in North Carolina to officials at the Department of Homeland Security to political pundits like Bill O'Reilly have called them terrorists. A rather harsh reception for a group whose biggest offense was stalling traffic for a few hours and who posed minimal threat to public safety. Contrast that to the group of white men who took over the Mahler National Wildlife Refuge in Oregon as they protested their right to graze their livestock on federal land. In a piece by the LA Times, these white protesters are labeled freedom fighters, and a retrospective documentary of the incident by PBS is entitled American Patriot: Inside the Armed Uprising Against the Federal Government. In addition, the Mahler standoff resulted in absolutely no criminal convictions, not even so much as a ticket for disorderly conduct for the 41-day armed insurrection that cost taxpayers $6 million. Clearly, these white protesters are seen in a much more favorable way, even when they engaged in far more egregious behaviors than the African American protesters. Just 2 months after the Mahler standoff ended in 2016, another protest formed. This group believed that their cultural heritage was not being valued and respected, and took a peaceful, albeit disruptive approach. This group believed that a construction project not only threatened their drinking water, but other important cultural landmarks. And just a year later, in 2017, a protest of an almost identical origin arose when a group in Virginia believed that their cultural heritage was not being valued and respected. This group was upset that their own cultural landmarks were being destroyed, and organized their own rally. Now, this first group decided to oppose the construction project by camping out on federal land, a similar act to that of the Mahler standoff, with the very big distinction that these protesters were unarmed and engaged in only non-violent resistance. And while they disrupted construction by refusing to leave the area, they did not engage in any violent behavior. This second group decided to march through the streets of Charlottesville to oppose the removal of Confederate statues and monuments. And while they weren't armed with guns, they were armed with hate and violence, carrying Nazi flags with swastikas and dressed in white robes and hoods. This rally turned deadly when a protester rammed his car into a group of counter-protesters, killing 1 and injuring 19 others. So, while these protests formed for the same reason, to protect and defend their cultural heritage, the Native Americans at Standing Rock relied on non-violent resistance, while the white, Unite the Right protesters in Charlottesville relied on provocative signs and symbols, resorting to violence when people challenged them. So, how did police and law enforcement respond to these two situations? The Guardian reported at the time of the Standing Rock protest that police had acknowledged using sponge rounds, beanbag rounds, stinger rounds, tasers, tear gas grenades, pepper spray, mace, and a sound weapon. In addition, television stations routinely showed video of police using water cannons to spray Native American protesters when the temperatures were below freezing. As for the white men marching through the streets with symbols representing the mass murder of 6 million people, primarily of Jewish descent, wearing white robes and hoods representing a hate group with a long history of murdering black people, the police lined the streets to protect these men and their right to free speech. Police and law enforcement engaged in no activity to discourage their protest. No tear gas, no rubber bullets, nothing. In fact, just the opposite happened. If not for police protection, these men would have been run out of town by the counter-protesters. So, let's recap. When black people peacefully protest an oppressive government, they are demonized as thugs and terrorists. When white men violently protest an oppressive government, they are glorified as patriots and freedom fighters. When Native Americans use non-violent resistance to protect their cultural heritage, they are attacked by police with tear gas and tasers. When white men celebrate hateful, racist symbols to protect their cultural heritage, they are protected by the police. While the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution protects our right to protest, stating Congress shall pass no law abridging the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances, you can see that not all protests are treated equally. While they may form for the same reason, how we respond to these protests depends largely on who the protesters are and what color their skin is. So, how do we address this issue? Well, the solution lies with white people. We must stop promoting this false narrative that when white people protest, they are showing how much they love their country. And when people of color protest, they are showing how much they hate it and should go back where they came from. We must begin to see the racist hypocrisy of our responses to these protests and protect the unique voices of our nation as they engage their constitutional right to protest. In his final speech the night before his assassination, Dr. King referred to our Constitution by challenging us with these words. All we say to America is, be true to what you said on paper. Over 50 years later, and we still have yet to meet his challenge and achieve his post-racial dream.